A man stands alone in a small apartment. The room is spare. One chair, one table, a window letting in grey afternoon light. He is wearing the full vestments of a Catholic priest, and his hands will not stop shaking. He reaches for the cincture first, the woven cord around his waist. His fingers work the knot slowly, like a man diffusing something. The cord falls, then the chasuble, then, last of all, the collar. He lifts it from his neck with both hands, holds it up to the window. 4 seconds. That is all it takes. 4 seconds to undo what took years to build. He holds it there a moment longer. Then he sets it on the table, and he walks away from it. We do not yet know his name. We do not yet know what he found. We only know that something sacred has just been broken, and that the breaking of it was not done in anger. It was done in grief. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. Drop it in the comments below. Now let's begin. To understand what this moment costs, you have to understand what it means to become a priest in the first place. Not the paperwork, not the theology, the weight of it. The actual, physical, irreversible weight. It begins with years. In the United States, a man studying for the priesthood completes undergraduate level instruction in philosophy, then 4 to 5 years of graduate level seminary formation in theology. A master of divinity, years of spiritual formation before the books even open, years more of pastoral practice after they close. By the time a man kneels before a bishop to be ordained, he has given a decade or more of his life to this single moment. And the moment itself. Picture it. The candidate lies face down on the cold stone floor before the altar, prostrate, completely. The congregation kneels behind him. The choir sings the litany of the saints, every name rising into the vaulted ceiling like smoke. The bishop approaches in silence and places both hands on the candidate's head. No words, just hands. Then every priest in the room does the same, one by one. Hands on a bowed head. The weight of 2,000 years pressing down through each set of palms. The Catholic Church teaches that this moment connects backward in an unbroken chain. Bishop to bishop, generation to generation. All the way to the 12 men who stood in an upper room in Jerusalem and heard a voice say, "Do this in memory of me." When you are ordained a Catholic priest, you are not just joining an institution. You are being threaded into a lineage that the Church traces directly to the apostles themselves. That is not a small thing to walk away from. That is not a small thing to sit on a table and leave behind. After the laying on of hands, the newly ordained priest is vested with the stole and chasuble of the ministerial priesthood. The bishop anoints his hands with chrism oil, the scent of it sweet and ancient, filling the sanctuary. Then he is presented with the chalice and paten he will use when he stands at the altar. The Church teaches that from this moment forward, when he speaks the words of consecration over bread and wine, he acts in persona Christi Capitis, in the person of Christ himself, not as a symbol, not as a representative, as Christ. That is the theology. And for a young man kneeling on cold stone with oil on his hands and tears on his face, it is not abstract, it is the most real thing in the world. Now imagine that same man, years later, standing in a grey apartment with a collar in his hands. What would he have had to see? What would he have had to learn? What truth could be so large, so immovable, so impossible to contain, that it would make a man undo all of that? The Vatican is not a metaphor, it is a place. 49 hectares of walled sovereign territory sitting inside the city of Rome like a secret kept in plain sight. The smallest country on earth by both area and population. In 2024, fewer than 900 people lived within its walls. It has its own coins, its own stamps, its own radio station, organized in the 20th century by Guglielmo Marconi himself, its own bank, formerly called the Institute for Works of Religion, which conducts financial activities across the world. It came into formal existence on the 11th of February 1929 when the Lateran Treaty was signed by Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Gasparri on behalf of Pope Pius XI and by Benito Mussolini on behalf of the Kingdom of Italy. Before that treaty, popes had spent nearly 60 years as what Pope Pius IX himself called prisoners in the Vatican, refusing to leave the walls after Italian forces seized Rome in 1870. 60 years of refusing to step outside. Think about what that does to an institution. Think about what it does to the men inside it. Because the Vatican is not just a city, it is the administrative center of a church that in 2018 counted 1,329,000,000 baptized members across the earth. The Pope exercises full legislative, executive, and judicial power over Vatican City. He is, quite literally, the only absolute monarch remaining in Europe. The Roman Curia, the body of dicasteries and offices that help govern this global institution, operates from inside those 49 hectares, making decisions that ripple outward to every continent, every diocese, every parish where a priest stands at an altar on a Sunday morning. And somewhere inside that structure, our priest found something. He carried it for a while. He turned it over in his hands the way he once turned the chalice. He prayed about it. He lost sleep over it. He watched the institution he had given his life to continue operating as though nothing had changed, and something inside him began to fracture. There are over 400,000 Catholic priests in the world, 415,000 according to figures from 2014, each one ordained through that same unbroken chain. Each one standing at altars from Lagos to Lima to Seoul, presiding over the Eucharist, hearing confessions, anointing the sick, marrying couples, baptizing children. A vast, interlocking human structure held together by doctrine and devotion and an oath taken before God. Most of them will never make headlines. Most of them will live and die in the quiet service of their parishes, their names known only to the people they buried and baptized. But some of them, a small and specific number, are positioned close enough to the center to see what the center actually looks like. Close enough to smell the incense and the politics mixing together in the same corridor. Close enough to hear conversations that were never meant to leave the room. Our man was one of those. And what he found did not stay inside him. It could not. Because he had taken an oath, long before the oath, to keep the institution's secrets. He had lain face down on a cold stone floor and given his life to something he believed was true. And when the truth he was asked to protect turned out to be something else entirely, the two oaths could not coexist. Something had to break. The apartment is almost dark now. The grey light from the window has faded to the color of old stone. The collar sits on the table where he left it. Outside, Rome continues its ancient business, indifferent as it has always been to the men who have come and gone through those walled gardens on the hill. Caligula built a circus there. Nero finished it. The bones of martyrs are buried beneath the basilica's floor. 2,000 years of human weight pressing down into that small patch of earth. And now, one more man has walked away from it. His voice enters the room before we see his face. It is steady, quieter than you expect. I took an oath before God to speak truth, he says. But the truth they asked me to keep was a lie. The screen goes dark, and you hear it. A door, closing, final, absolute, irreversible. The collar is placed around his neck for the first time on a morning so bright it hurts to look at the cathedral steps. Sunlight pours through the high windows in long white columns. The smell of beeswax and old stone fills the air. His mother is in the third row, her hands pressed together so tightly her knuckles have gone pale. She is weeping, not from sadness, from something that has no clean name in any language. Pride, maybe. Or relief. Or the particular joy of watching a child become the thing you always believed he was meant to be. The bishop smiles. The congregation smiles. The organ fills the vaulted ceiling with sound so full it seems to have weight. But look at the young man's face. Look carefully. His eyes are not lifted toward the altar. They are fixed on the bishop, on the ring. On the way, the older man carries himself through a room the way the room reorganizes itself around him. The young man is watching how power moves. He does not know that yet. He would not call it that. But something in him is already paying attention to the wrong thing, or perhaps the right thing, 30 years too early. To understand what breaks a man, you have to go back to what built him. He grew up in post-war Europe, in a world still learning how to breathe again. The cities around him were in various stages of being rebuilt, stone by stone, memory by memory. And into that fragile, exhausted world, the church moved like something ancient and unshakable. It had bells when everything else was silent. It had answers when everyone else had only questions. For a small boy watching his parents kneel on cold stone floors, it was not just religion, it was the architecture of meaning itself. His family were not merely Catholic in the way that millions of European families were Catholic, out of habit, out of inheritance, out of not knowing what else to be. They were Catholic the way a house is made of brick. It went all the way through. His grandfather had known the local bishop personally. His mother organized the parish feast days with the intensity of a military campaign. Faith was not something they practiced. It was something they were. And so, when the boy showed signs of genuine vocation, when he began asking questions about scripture that embarrassed older students, when the parish priest quietly mentioned to his parents that the boy had something rare, the family did not hesitate. They pointed him toward the door, and they opened it wide. He was selected for seminary before he was 17. In the world he came from, this was not just an honor, it was a transformation of the family's standing. Neighbors spoke of it with a reverence usually reserved for the dead. His mother lit candles in the church for 3 consecutive Sundays. His father, a man who expressed almost nothing with words, gripped his son's shoulder once at the train station and held on for a moment longer than he needed to. The seminary was beautiful in the way that institutions built to impress always are. High ceilings, long corridors that turned footsteps into echoes. A garden where the older students walked in the early morning, their black robes moving through the mist like something from a painting. The young man arrived with a mind full of questions and a heart full of something he would have called love. Love for God. Love for the idea that a life could be organized around something true and permanent and good. For the first months, it felt exactly like what he had imagined. The silence of early morning prayer. The low murmur of Latin filling a chapel before dawn. The cold of the stone floor pressing through thin soles, grounding him in the body even as the words tried to lift him out of it. He was hungry for it. He read past the assigned texts. He argued with his tutors, politely but persistently, in the way that only the truly devout can argue, not to win, but because the questions felt urgent and alive. But something else was happening too. Slowly, quietly, the way a temperature drops in a room before anyone thinks to check. He began to notice that the questions he loved most were the ones that made his superiors uncomfortable. Not angry, not at first, just uncomfortable. A slight stillness in the face, a redirection. A gentle suggestion that certain lines of inquiry were, perhaps, better left to more senior theologians. He noticed that the students who advanced most quickly were not the ones who thought most deeply. They were the ones who repeated most faithfully, who kept their eyes forward, who learned, with impressive speed, the particular art of having no visible interior life. He was good at the work, too good in some ways to be quietly managed. So instead of being discouraged, he was encouraged, elevated, moved closer to the center, given more responsibility, more access, more proximity to the men who ran things. He told himself this was because his faith was recognized, and maybe it was. But proximity to power has its own logic, and it does not always run parallel to virtue. There was a morning, early in his 2nd year, when he overheard 2 senior priests speaking in a corridor. He had not meant to hear. He had simply turned a corner at the wrong moment. He does not say, even now, exactly what was said. But he says this. He stood very still for a long time afterward, his back against the cold stone wall, his breath coming in short, careful intervals. He was not ready to name what he had heard. He folded the moment away somewhere deep and kept walking. That is how it begins, not with a single revelation, with a fold, and then another fold, and another, until the thing you are carrying has so many layers that you can barely feel its original shape anymore. The years of formation did what they were designed to do. They took a boy with questions and gave him a structure. They gave him language, community, purpose, and a role. They gave him the collar, and with it, a self. What they did not give him, what they were not designed to give him, was permission to look directly at the institution that had formed him and ask whether it was what it claimed to be, because that was not the point of the formation. He sees that now. The point was not to produce men who could think freely inside the church. The point was to produce men who were the church, indistinguishable from it, useful to it, loyal to it in the specific way that a hand is loyal to the body it belongs to. It does not question, it moves when told, and for years he was willing to do that. He was more than willing, he was grateful. Because the alternative, the life outside those walls, outside that structure, outside that certainty, felt like something close to falling. And no one wants to fall. Especially not a boy from a devout family in a shattered post-war world. A boy who had organized his entire self around the idea that there was something solid at the center of things. He kept his questions folded. He kept his eyes forward. He advanced. There is a photograph from those years. A seminary photograph, the kind taken every year. Dozens of young men in identical black, arranged in identical rows, their faces scrubbed and earnest and carefully composed. You can find him in the third row. He is looking directly at the camera. His expression is calm, certain, committed. Every single man in that photograph looks exactly like every other man. That was not an accident. It was the outcome. It was the product of years of careful, patient, loving pressure applied in exactly the right places to produce exactly the right shape. He looks at that photograph now, and his voice drops to something barely above a whisper. They didn't want us to ask questions, he says. They wanted us to become instruments. He pauses, looks at the photograph for a moment longer. And for years, he says, I was willing to be one. The suit is better now. That much is obvious. Not the rough seminary black, worn thin at the elbows, smelling of candle wax and communal dining halls. This is something different, tailored, pressed. The kind of clothing that signals arrival, that says, quietly but unmistakably, that the man wearing it belongs somewhere important. He belongs somewhere important. His office window looks out over St. Peter's Square. Think about what that means for a moment. Below him, the obelisk that Caligula dragged from Egypt, that Nero used to mark the center of a circus where Christians burned. Around it, Bernini's great colonnade, curving outward like arms reaching for the world. And beyond that, the square itself, where on any given morning, thousands of pilgrims stand with their faces tilted upward, searching for something they cannot name but desperately need. He looks at all of this every day. It is his view. His ordinary, unremarkable, daily view. This is what success looks like inside the most ancient institution on earth. It did not happen quickly. Nothing inside these walls happens quickly. The Vatican is 49 hectares of carefully managed time, a city-state where the pace of centuries still governs the pace of days. Advancement here is measured not in years, but in demonstrated loyalty, in accumulated patience, in the slow accumulation of trust from men who trust almost no one. He had spent years earning exactly that. Obedient, capable, discreet. The right combination, it turned out, of intellectual sharpness and institutional deference. Sharp enough to be useful, deferential enough to be safe. And so the assignments came. First, the small ones. Administrative work, document processing, correspondence that required someone who could read carefully and say nothing. Then the larger ones. rooms he had not been in before, meetings where the names on the door meant something. The Secretariat of State, which manages the Vatican's diplomatic relationships with the world, a body that functions less like a church office and more like the foreign ministry of a small but extraordinarily influential sovereign state. Corridors where cardinals walked with the specific, unhurried purpose of men who hold authority so deep it no longer needs to announce itself. He sat across from those men. He read their documents. He carried their instructions. He told himself this was exactly what he had hoped for. He told himself that from inside this structure, with access like this, with proximity like this, a person of conscience could do genuine good. He told himself the church needed people like him precisely here, at the center, where the decisions were made. He repeated these things with the practiced ease of someone who has been repeating them long enough that they no longer pause to examine whether they are still true. He was lying to himself. He would say this later, plainly, without self-pity, not a dramatic confession, just a fact. The air inside the Apostolic Palace in summer carries a particular smell. Stone that has absorbed centuries of incense, of candle smoke, of the breath of men who believed they were doing God's work. It is cool even in the heat, the walls thick enough to hold the temperature of another season entirely. You walk those corridors and you feel the weight of the institution pressing down from above, from every side, not oppressively at first, reassuringly, like being held. He felt held. He felt chosen. He was grateful. But gratitude, he was learning, had a price inside these walls. Gratitude meant not asking certain questions. It meant filing certain documents without reading them too carefully. It meant understanding that your access to this place, your presence in these rooms, your seat at these tables was contingent, not on your conscience, on your usefulness, on your continued willingness to be the instrument the institution required you to be. The seminary had prepared him for exactly this. He could see that now, though he could not have named it then. The years of formation, the careful shaping of thought, the quiet discouragement of questions that cut too deep. All of it had been practice. This was the real thing. Promotion followed promotion. Each one arrived with the same formula. A brief acknowledgement of his service, a new title, a new set of responsibilities, a slightly larger orbit within which to operate, and with each expansion of that orbit, a slightly clearer view of what the institution actually was, beneath the marble and the incense and the language of divine mission. What he saw was this: power, organized with extraordinary sophistication, protecting itself, not always cynically. That is the important thing. The thing that makes it complicated. The thing that made it so hard to name at the time. Many of the men around him were genuinely devout. Many of them believed, completely and without reservation, that what they were protecting was sacred. The church was the body of Christ on earth. To protect the institution was to protect something holy. The logic was airtight from the inside. It only looked like something else when he stepped outside it, and stepping outside it was precisely what the entire system was designed to prevent. He did not step outside it. Not yet. He kept his head down. He kept his expression neutral in rooms where neutrality was the only safe currency. He advanced. In 1982, a man named Ettore Gotti Tedeschi would eventually run the Vatican Bank, the Institute for Works of Religion, that quiet financial agency inside the walls that conducted financial activities across the world. But long before that scandal broke, the patterns were already there, visible to anyone with the right access and the willingness to look. Contracts awarded at prices that did not reflect the market. Correspondence between senior officials that described internal campaigns against individuals who had asked the wrong questions. Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò, who had served as the second-ranked Vatican administrator directly beneath the Pope, would later write letters describing corruption that had cost the Holy See artificially high contract prices, and describing what he called a campaign of defamation against him for have. Eng raised the issue. Those letters would eventually be published. In 2012, Italian journalist Gianluigi Nuzzi would put them in a book, and the world would call it a scandal, and the Vatican would call it a betrayal, and Pope Benedict would stand before his weekly general audience and speak of sadness in his heart. But the patterns those letters described were not new. They had not appeared suddenly. They had been there, accumulating for a long time, in offices exactly like the one he sat in documents exactly like the ones he processed, in the specific institutional culture of a place that had learned, across many centuries, how to absorb accountability and neutralize it. He was part of that culture. He had been shaped by it, promoted by it, rewarded by it. His calm expression in those rooms, his reliable discretion, his careful management of information that other people were not meant to see. These were not incidental to his advancement. They were the reason for it. He told himself he was different from the men who had built this system. He told himself his conscience was still intact, still his own, still capable of drawing a line somewhere. He told himself that the compromises he had made were small ones, pragmatic ones, the kind of thing any person makes when operating inside a large and complex institution. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica marked the hours. They had marked the hours for centuries, that deep, unhurried tolling, indifferent to whatever was happening inside the walls beneath them. Pilgrims in the square below looked up when they rang. He stopped hearing them years ago. That is the thing about slow corruption. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a choice between good and evil. It arrives as a series of small, reasonable adjustments, each one defensible on its own, each one made in a context that makes refusal seem naive or disloyal or simply impractical. And then one day you look up and you are somewhere you did not consciously choose to be, and the path back is no longer visible. He was somewhere he had not consciously chosen to be. And then the memo arrived. It came on an ordinary morning. The kind of morning where the light through his window fell across the square in long, pale angles, and the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside was the only sound, and the smell of coffee from somewhere down the hall was the most human thing in the building. An ordinary morning. The kind you do not remember later for any reason except what happened in it. The envelope was marked in the way that certain envelopes inside these walls are marked, not loudly, just a stamp, neat and official, 2 words in Italian, strictly confidential. He opened it. He read it. His hands go cold as he described this moment. Not metaphorically cold, physically cold, the way hands go cold when blood retreats from the surface of the body because something deeper has just shifted. He sat very still. He read the document again. Then he set it down on the desk in front of him and looked at the window and did not look away for a long time. He would later describe this as the first moment he truly understood what he had become. Not a servant of God, not a reformer working from within, not the earnest young man from that seminary photograph, looking directly at the camera with his expression of calm certainty. A keeper of secrets. The question that followed him out of that office and down those ancient stone corridors and into the Roman afternoon was not what was in the document. It was simpler than that. It was this: how long had he known and how long had he chosen not to? The memo was just the beginning. He had thought, in that first cold moment of reading it, that this was the worst of it, that the document in his hands represented the outer edge of what the institution was capable of hiding. He was wrong. He was so completely wrong that later, looking back, he would almost feel sorry for the man he was in that moment, sitting at that desk, thinking he had found the bottom. There is no bottom. He spent the next 2 years inside those administrative offices, and what he found there did not arrive all at once. It came in layers, each layer thinner than the last, each one revealing something darker underneath. The first layer was money. It always starts with money. The Vatican's finances were not, on paper, a mystery. There were accounts, there were contracts, there were spreadsheets with long columns of numbers that were supposed to balance, and mostly they did, on the surface. But he had a careful mind. He had always had a careful mind. And careful minds notice when numbers that are supposed to balance are balanced just a little too neatly. When a contract price for renovation work on a Vatican building comes in at a figure that no legitimate contractor would charge. When the same vendor wins the same category of contract year after year without any competitive process that anyone can point to. He pulled the files. He cross-referenced the figures. The smell in the archive room was old paper and something faintly chemical. The particular scent of documents that had been stored too long in rooms not quite ventilated enough. He would spend hours in that room. The fluorescent light above his desk hummed at a frequency just below comfortable, a sound you stopped hearing after 20 minutes and then heard again all at once when you finally looked up. He looked up often, not because he needed to rest his eyes, because what he was reading kept making him stop. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano had already tried to say something about this. Vigano, formerly the second-ranked administrator in the Vatican, had written letters to the Pope, letters to Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, the Secretary of State. In those letters, Vigano had complained directly about corruption in Vatican finances, about contracts awarded at artificially inflated prices, about costs that were draining the Holy See of millions. He had begged not to be transferred. He had named names. He had been transferred anyway. That transfer was its own document. It sat in a folder with other documents about Vigano, and it told a story about what happened to people who noticed things and said so. You did not get punished openly. There was no confrontation, no public rebuke. You simply found yourself reassigned, moved to Washington, given a new title and a new office, and a long flight away from the files you had been reading. The message was clear enough, but Vigano's letters were only the beginning of what he found. Behind the financial irregularities, behind the inflated contracts and the money disappearing into private accounts, there was something else. Something that made the financial corruption feel, by comparison, almost administrative, almost clean. He found the abuse files. They did not announce themselves. They were not filed under any heading that would draw attention. They were folded into other categories, buried in administrative correspondence, referenced in memos that used language so careful and so deliberately vague that you could read them quickly and understand nothing. He did not read them quickly. A child's name, partially redacted, not well enough. You could still read the first letters. You could still see the age listed in the margin. 8 years old, 11 years old, 14. The complaints were there. The accusations were there, written in the careful language of official correspondence, stripped of all the terror that must have lived inside them when they were first spoken aloud by a child to an adult who was supposed to help. And next to those complaints, in the same files, were the responses. Not investigations, not referrals to civil authorities, not letters to families saying that something would be done, that the person responsible would face consequences, that the church took this seriously. The responses were transfers. A priest named in one diocese would appear months later in correspondence from a different diocese entirely. A new parish, a new community, a new group of children who had no reason to suspect anything because no one had told them, because someone in an office, very much like the one he now sat in, had made a decision. A deliberate, documented, administrative decision to move the problem rather than solve it. He sat with that for a long time, the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, the distant, muffled toll of a bell somewhere in the city. He sat very still and read the same memo 3 times, and on the third reading, he understood that the language used in it was not the language of an institution that had failed to respond properly. It was the language of an institution that had responded exactly as it intended to, with precision, with coordination, with the full administrative machinery of one of the oldest organizations on earth deployed in service of one goal: protecting itself. There were communications between senior church officials, cardinals coordinating with other cardinals, letters moving between offices about specific priests in specific locations. The tone was not panicked. It was not the tone of men scrambling to contain a crisis they had not anticipated. It was the tone of men managing a process they had managed before. Routine, methodical. The same careful bureaucratic language applied to moving a predator from one community to another as was applied to reassigning a bishop or approving a budget line. He photographed what he could. He memorized what he could not photograph. He wrote nothing down in his own hand because he had begun to understand by this point that the walls of that building were not neutral. That the archive room with its humming light and its chemical smell was not a place where a man could simply read and think and come to his own conclusions without consequence. Paolo Gabriele had understood that too in his way. The papal butler, a man who had been inside those walls since 2007, who had sat close enough to the center of things to see what was there, and who had eventually decided that the seeing was not enough. Gabriele had taken documents, physical documents, letters and memos addressed to the Pope and to Vatican officials, and he had carried them out of the building and passed them to a journalist. He had been arrested in May of 2012. Vatican police had found classified papers in his apartment, including documents the Pope himself had marked to be destroyed. Marked to be destroyed. Think about that. Not filed, not archived, not reviewed and sealed for a future generation of historians to examine. Destroyed. The instruction was written on the documents themselves, and a man had been arrested for keeping them. Gabriele said at his trial that he had done it to fight evil and corruption, to put the Vatican back on track. A Vatican judge later found him guilty of aggravated theft. He served his sentence inside the Vatican itself, not in an Italian prison, because there were concerns that if he sat in a regular prison, he might say more. The institution that had convicted him for revealing its secrets then kept him close enough to monitor, even in punishment. He read the trial documents too. He read about Ettore Gotti Tedeschi, the president of the Vatican Bank, dismissed in part because of his failure to explain how documents that had been in his possession ended up in other people's hands. He read about Claudio Schiappelletti, a computer specialist at the Secretariat of State, convicted of giving conflicting information to prosecutors. He read about the 3 cardinals appointed by Pope Benedict to investigate the leaks, directed by Cardinal Julian Herranz Casado of Opus Dei, men who reportedly discovered not just financial corruption, but a sex and blackmail scandal running beneath the financial one. That report went directly to the Pope. And then the Pope resigned. Benedict announced his resignation in February of 2013. The first Pope to step down voluntarily in almost 600 years. The official reason given was declining health and energy. And maybe that was true. Maybe a man in his mid-80s, carrying the weight of what those cardinals had put in front of him, genuinely felt that he could not continue. Maybe the report on the lobbies and the networks and the things that lived in the spaces between the official version of events simply confirmed what he had already begun to feel in his bones. Or maybe the weight of knowing is its own kind of exhaustion. He knew about that weight by now. He felt it in his legs at the end of each day, a heaviness that had nothing to do with how much he had walked. He felt it in the way he held his shoulders, always slightly raised, always slightly braced, as though expecting something to land on them. His throat was dry most mornings before he had said a single word. He would drink his coffee and look at the light coming through the window and feel the specific exhaustion of a man who is carrying something he cannot put down and cannot share, because he was part of it. That was the thing he could not stop returning to. Not an innocent observer who had stumbled into a library of crimes. He had been given access to those files because he was trusted, because he had been vetted and approved and welcomed into the administrative structure that produced them. He had signed documents. He had processed correspondence. He had, on at least 2 occasions that he could identify clearly in his memory, forwarded communications that he now understood were part of the coordination apparatus, the machinery that moved men from parish to parish and buried complaints in folders with partially redacted names. He had not known what he was forwarding, but he had forwarded it. That distinction between not knowing and choosing not to know had begun to feel very thin. In July of 2016, an Italian court acquitted 2 journalists who had published leaked Vatican documents, citing freedom of expression. Judge Giuseppe Della Torre declared that the court had no legitimate jurisdiction over the journalists Gianluigi Nuzzi and Emiliano Fittipaldi. The institution had tried to prosecute the people who had brought its secrets into the light. It had failed. But Monsignor Lucio Balda, who had leaked the documents to those journalists, was sentenced to 18 months in a Vatican cell. His requests for a papal pardon were met with silence for months. The institution protected itself first, always first. He stood in his office late one night, long after the corridors had gone quiet and the last footsteps had faded, and the only sound was the distant wind moving through the square outside. He was holding a photograph he had taken of a single document, a list of names. Children's names, some partially obscured, some not obscured at all, beside a memo dated 10 years earlier. The memo was stamped in the way that certain memos inside these walls are stamped, not loudly, just a phrase, neat and official: "Do not investigate." The paper in his hand was cold. His fingers were cold against it. He looked at the names and thought about the children those names had belonged to 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Children who had sat in pews and trusted adults in robes and believed, the way children believe, that the people responsible for their care were actually responsible for their care. He thought about the cardinal who had signed the memo, the office it had passed through, the hands that had received it and filed it and not asked any questions, because the asking of questions was not what those officers were for. He thought about his own hands. He looked at the document for a long time. Then he set it down on the desk in front of him and looked at the window and did not look away. Outside, the square was empty. The ancient stones said nothing. The city breathed in the dark around him. He whispered it to himself, not as a discovery, but as an ending. The last word on something he had been refusing to finish saying for 2 years. They knew. They always knew. And they chose the institution over the children. The photograph sat on the desk. The wind moved outside. And somewhere in the building around him, in the folders and the files and the carefully worded memos, the names of the children waited in the dark. The photograph is still on his desk when the summons arrives. Not a formal summons. Nothing so honest as that. Just a folded note slipped under his door sometime in the early morning, the kind of delivery that happens before the corridors fill with footsteps and voices. He finds it when he wakes. His name on the outside, written in a hand he does not recognize. Inside, 4 words. The cardinal requests you. No time given. No reason. No agenda. He stands there in his small room, the note in one hand, and feels something cold move through his chest that has nothing to do with the morning air. He had told no one about the document. Not a single person. He had taken the photograph alone, in a room he had entered alone, and he had carried it back to his quarters in a jacket pocket, pressed against his ribs the whole walk through the stone corridors. He had not written about it, had not spoken about it, had not even let himself think about it too clearly until the door was shut and locked behind him. And yet, the cardinal requests you. He dresses slowly. His hands feel thick and clumsy at the buttons. Outside his window, the Vatican gendarmerie is already moving through its morning routines. Officers in dark blue uniforms crossing the courtyard below, radios clipped to their shoulders, earpieces in. 130 of them inside these walls. He had never thought about that number before. Now he does. He folds the note and puts it in his pocket and goes. The cardinal's office smells of old wood and cold candle smoke. The cardinal himself is standing at the window when the priest enters, looking out at the square below with his hands clasped behind his back. He does not turn immediately. He lets the silence sit. Then he turns, and his face is composed and warm and entirely unreadable, and he gestures to the chair across the desk with the practiced ease of a man who has been managing other men for decades. They speak about small things first. The weather, a recent ceremony, a visiting delegation from South America. The cardinal pours water from a crystal pitcher and asks about his work, his research, his health, his sleep. Ordinary questions asked in an ordinary voice. And then, without shifting his tone even slightly, the cardinal mentions a particular archive, a particular corridor, a particular type of document that has been attracting attention recently from people asking questions they are not, strictly speaking, authorized to ask. The priest keeps his face still. He does not reach for the water glass. He does not move at all. The cardinal says the name of the archive. He says the approximate date of the documents in question. He does not say the word children. He does not need to. The priest looks at the cardinal's hands resting flat on the desk and says nothing. The cardinal smiles. He says that curiosity is a gift, of course. He says that the church has always valued inquiry, always valued the searching mind. He says this warmly, as if he means it. Then he says that there are inquiries which, pursued without proper guidance, without proper context, can lead a man to conclusions that are not just wrong, but damaging. Damaging to himself, damaging to the institution he has given his life to serve. He pauses after that. He lets the word institution sit in the air between them. The priest walks back to his quarters along a corridor that feels narrower than it did an hour ago. The stone walls press inward on both sides. His footsteps sound too loud against the floor. He passes two gendarmes at a corner, both of them standing with the practiced stillness of men who are paid to notice things, and he does not look at them, and they do not look away from him. That evening, he goes to find Father Tommaso. Father Tommaso is the one person inside these walls he had allowed himself to trust. Not fully, not with the photograph or the document or the names, but enough. Enough to have said weeks ago that something had troubled him in his research. Enough to have said that he had found certain gaps in certain records that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. Father Tommaso had listened carefully and said nothing useful and changed the subject, and the priest had thought at the time that this was caution, that it was wisdom. Father Tommaso's room is empty. His books are gone. The small photograph he kept on his desk, his mother standing in front of a church in Naples, is gone. The room smells of absence, the particular flat smell of a space that has been cleared out quickly, without ceremony. The priest asks at the administrative office. He keeps his voice level. He asks as if the answer does not matter. Father Tommaso has been reassigned. A mission. Overseas. Very suddenly, yes. These things happen. The church has needs in many places. He left 2 days ago. No, there is no forwarding address yet. These things take time to arrange. The priest thanks the clerk and walks away and does not let his face change until he is around the corner and out of sight. He goes back to his room. He goes to the drawer where he had placed the photograph. Not the original, which remains in the archive, but the copy he had made, the image on his phone, the one piece of evidence he actually held. The phone is there. The photograph is not. Someone has accessed it and deleted the file. Not the phone itself, which would have been too obvious. Just the file. Just that one file. Clean and quiet. The way certain things inside these walls are done. Not loudly, just efficiently. He sits on the edge of his bed and breathes. Outside, somewhere across the complex, a bell begins to ring for evening prayer. The sound moves through the stone and the glass and the old thick air of this place, the way it has moved every evening for centuries, regular and certain and indifferent to whoever is sitting in whatever room listening to it, with their hands pressed flat against their knees to stop the shaking. He thinks about the cardinal's face, composed, warm, entirely certain. He thinks about Father Tommaso's empty room, the photograph of the mother in Naples, gone. He thinks about the gendarmerie officer he passed in the corridor that morning, the one who had not looked away. 130 officers inside these walls. an operations center staffed 24 hours a day. Thousands of surveillance cameras covering not just Vatican City, but the extraterritorial properties beyond it. A rapid intervention group trained for what their own documents describe as combat in restricted environments. He had read all of this once, years ago, as administrative background, dry institutional detail that meant nothing to a priest doing archive work. It does not read that way now. He does not sleep that night. He lies on his back and stares at the ceiling and listens to the building breathe around him, the footsteps in distant corridors, the closing of heavy doors, the particular quality of silence that belongs to a place where people are always watching, even when you cannot see them watching. In the morning, he goes to Mass. He sits in the pew and mouths the words and feels nothing. And when the priest at the altar raises the host, he looks at his own hands in his lap and thinks about the cardinal's hands flat on the desk and the memo he can no longer prove he ever saw. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chapel, a senior bishop falls into step beside him. A large man, older, with the unhurried movement of someone who has never been required to rush anywhere. He smiles and asks how the priest is sleeping. He asks whether the research is going well. He mentions, almost as an aside, that the archive work can be demanding, taxing, that he has seen younger priests run themselves into the ground, chasing questions that lead nowhere, losing perspective, losing balance. He places one hand on the priest's shoulder. The grip is gentle, pastoral. The voice drops slightly, the way a voice drops when what follows is meant to sound like concern. He says that the church takes care of its own. He says that when priests show signs of strain, of obsessive thinking, of what he calls a disordered relationship with their work, there is help available. Good help. Qualified professionals. He says the Vatican has excellent psychiatric care for its priests. He says it is nothing to be ashamed of. He says that some men, when the pressure becomes too great, develop health issues, stress, mental strain. It is, he says, entirely understandable. He smiles again. He squeezes the shoulder once. Then he releases it and walks away down the corridor without looking back. The priest stands very still. The smell of incense from the chapel drifts out through the open door behind him. His shoulder feels cold where the hand had rested. He looks at the corridor ahead of him, the ancient stones stretching away in both directions, the cameras at the corners, the gendarme standing at the far end with a radio at his hip. He is not going to develop health issues. He is going to leave. He does not run. That is the first rule he sets for himself. Standing in that corridor with the smell of incense still clinging to his collar, and the cold weight of a stranger's hand still pressing into his shoulder like a brand. Running is what guilty men do, and he is not guilty. He is careful. For 6 weeks he becomes someone else entirely. He attends Mass. He nods at colleagues in the hallways of the Apostolic Palace. He eats in the refectory, makes small conversation, asks about someone's ailing mother. He is present, visible, unremarkable. Every morning he walks the same route across the ancient stones of Vatican City, past the fountains that catch the early light, past the Swiss guards standing at attention in their striped uniforms at Porta Sant'Anna, and he makes sure to nod. He makes sure to be seen. But inside that ordinary shell, every minute is accounted for. The USB drive comes first. It is no larger than his thumbnail, barely a weight at all. When he slides it into the spine of a prayer book he carries everywhere. Nobody searches a priest's prayer book. That is a truth he relies on, and it holds. The drive fills slowly, over days, with photographs he takes on a phone he bought for cash at a market stall near Piazza Navona, a market where nobody knows his face. Each photograph is a document. Each document is a reason someone powerful would prefer he not exist. He does not think about that for long. The journalist is a woman he barely knows. They have met twice at academic events where she covered Vatican policy for a Northern European newspaper. She is not famous. That is why he chose her. Famous journalists attract attention. She attracts none. Their meetings are brief and conducted in places where brevity is built into the architecture. A confession booth near the Pantheon, where the partition between them means two strangers speaking quietly, is simply what the space is for. A museum gallery, where the background noise of shuffling tourists swallows conversation whole. He slides a folded piece of paper across a bench without looking at her. She picks it up without looking at him. They have established a protocol so simple, it is almost elegant. She is frightened. He can see it in the way she folds the paper immediately into her bag, the way her eyes move to the exits. He does not blame her. He is frightened too. His hands are dry and his throat is dry, and some mornings he wakes at 4 a.m. with his heart already running before his mind catches up. But fear, he has discovered, is not the same as stopping. The next task is the hardest. He needs documentation that belongs to him and also does not belong to him. He needs to exist officially as two people simultaneously. The ordination papers he obtains through the records office on a pretext so mundane it almost embarrasses him. He tells the clerk he needs a certified copy for a diocesan administrative matter in a parish he names from memory, a parish he once visited years ago and which is far enough away to make verification slow. The clerk barely looks up. She stamps the form and tells him to come back Thursday. He comes back Thursday. He takes the papers and thanks her warmly and walks back out into the thin Roman winter sunlight. The forged passport takes longer. That contact he had made years earlier, in a context he had never imagined would become relevant. A man who did quiet work for people navigating complicated situations. The priest does not let himself think too hard about what other situations that man had navigated. He pays in cash. He waits. The document arrives in a padded envelope left at the front desk of a small hotel near Termini Station, addressed to a name that is not his. He retrieves it wearing different clothes than he usually wears. He reads it on a bench in the Borghese Gardens with pigeons at his feet and the smell of damp grass rising from the ground around him, and his hands do not shake until he puts it back in his pocket. Then they shake. He gives them a moment. Then he stands and walks. There are cameras at the corners of every corridor inside Vatican City. He has counted them over the years without meaning to, the way you count anything you see every day. He knows which angles cover which approaches. He knows which routes are quieter and which are not. Vatican City is tiny. 120 acres in total, the whole sovereign state of it, smaller than many city parks. You can walk its entire border in 20 minutes, but small does not mean simple. Small means watched. Small means everyone knows everyone. Small means a change in routine is a visible thing. So he does not change his routine. He maintains it with a discipline that costs him more than anything physical ever has. There is one afternoon in the 5th week when a colleague stops him near the Vatican museums and asks if he is feeling well. He says yes, a little tired, the archive work. The colleague nods sympathetically and says the same thing the bishop said, that the work can become consuming. That balance matters. He watches the colleague's face carefully for anything beneath the sympathy. He finds nothing conclusive. He smiles and says he will take a day's rest at the weekend. He does not take a day's rest. He photographs the last of the documents. On the final evening, he walks the grounds alone. It is just after 6, and the sky above Rome is doing something extraordinary, going from pale gold to deep rose to a blue so saturated it looks painted. The dome of St. Peter's Basilica rises 138 meters against that sky, the largest church in the world, and he has lived inside its shadow for years. He walks past the fountains in St. Peter's Square. The cobblestones are cold through the soles of his shoes. A few tourists are still taking photographs near the obelisk, the ancient Egyptian stone that Caligula brought to Rome and that has stood here since a time before most nations existed. He looks at it for a moment. He thinks about permanence. He thinks about what institutions do to protect themselves when they have lasted long enough to believe they will last forever. He thinks about the bishop's hand on his shoulder. He does not look back as he crosses the white line at the edge of the square. That line is all there is between Vatican City and Rome at that point. No wall, no checkpoint, just a line of white stone set into the ground where Piazza Pio XII begins and the world's smallest sovereign state ends. He steps over it without pausing. An Italian police officer stands nearby, watching the last of the tourists, and does not look at the priest walking past. He sleeps that night in a rented room near Trastevere, not his room at the Vatican. He has not slept there for 5 nights now, moving quietly, telling no one. His suitcase is already packed. It contains everything he owns that matters, which turns out to be very little. Some clothes, his personal documents, a hard drive, a prayer book with a USB drive in the spine, and copies of documents that name names. In the morning, he takes a train north. He sits by the window and watches Rome slide away behind him. The ochre and terracotta of it, the pines on the hills, the long flat light of the Italian morning spreading across the Campagna. He drinks a coffee from a paper cup. It is bitter and too hot, and he burns the roof of his mouth. And that small, stupid, ordinary pain is somehow the most real thing he has felt in weeks. He does not look at his phone. He does not read. He watches the landscape and he breathes. The border crossing is not what he expected. He had built it into something enormous in his mind, a gauntlet, a moment of reckoning. The reality is a low building, fluorescent light, the smell of floor cleaner and stale coffee, a queue of travelers moving through with the shuffling patience of people who do this regularly. The guard is a young woman with her hair pulled back. She holds out her hand for his passport without looking up. He places it in her hand. He is aware of his own heartbeat in a way that feels anatomical, like he can locate the exact chamber producing it. His throat is dry. The fluorescent light hums above him. Somewhere behind him in the queue, a child is complaining about something in a language he does not speak. The guard looks at the passport. She looks at the photograph. She looks at his face with the brief professional assessment that is not really assessment at all, just confirmation, just the motion of a job done 1,000 times. She stamps the page. The sound of it, that flat mechanical thud, is the loudest thing he has ever heard. She slides the passport back across the counter without a word. He picks it up. He walks through. On the other side, he stops for a moment. Not long. Just long enough to feel what is happening to him. The air outside is cold and smells faintly of diesel and wet tarmac. A bus idles nearby. Ordinary life moves around him in every direction. He has a suitcase containing everything he owns. He has a forged passport. He has copies of documents that could collapse an institution older than most nations. He has the name of a journalist who is frightened but who will answer when he calls. He has no home to return to. He has no community waiting for him. He has no one to call who does not exist inside the walls he has just left behind. For the first time in his adult life, there is no structure above him, no hierarchy, no ancient protocol determining where he stands and what he is permitted to say, no corridor with cameras at the corners, no hand on his shoulder with a grip that is gentle and pastoral and means something else entirely. He is outside its reach. He is outside its protection. He is outside everything he has known since he was a young man who believed that walls like those were built to keep the world out, rather than to keep the people inside in. He stands in the ordinary cold air with his suitcase at his feet. He is completely alone. He is, for the first time, free. The hotel room in Geneva smells of stale coffee and carpet cleaner. Outside, the lake sits grey and flat under a February sky. Inside, 3 journalists arrange their notebooks, and one of them reaches over to press record on a small digital device sitting between them on the table. He watches the red light come on. Then he says his name, not a cover name, not a title, not father, followed by something careful and deniable, his actual name, the name his mother gave him. The name that, until this moment, has existed inside Vatican walls for decades. attached to files and access codes, and the kind of institutional memory that never forgets and never forgives. He says it once, clearly, and the room changes. One of the journalists exhales slowly. Another writes something down immediately, as if the name itself is evidence, which of course it is. The third one, the one who has been doing this the longest, just looks at him steadily and nods once. She has heard confessions before, in her own way. She knows what it costs, a person to finally say the thing they have been carrying. He feels it leave him. The name, the secret of it, gone. And then he keeps talking. He tells them where he worked. He tells them what he saw. He tells them about the contracts, about the money that moved through Vatican accounts and came out the other side larger than it went in, about the vendors who charged prices that no one questioned because questioning was not what you did, about the officials who knew and said nothing, and the offi, childs, who knew and profited. He tells them about Ettore Gotti Tedeschi, removed from the presidency of the Vatican Bank, with one of the official reasons listed as failure to explain the dissemination of documents that had last been in his possession. He tells them what that kind of language means when institutions use it. It means someone got too close to something they were not supposed to touch. He tells them about Gianluigi Nuzzi, about the book published in May of 2012, the one titled His Holiness, the one built from confidential letters and internal memos, the one that described the Vatican as a place riven with jealousy and factional fighting and bribes paid for an audience with the Pope himself. He tells them that book did not come from nowhere. Documents like that do not walk out of buildings by accident. Someone carried them. Someone decided the world needed to see what was happening inside those walls. Paolo Gabriele carried them. The Pope's own butler, a man who had served Benedict since 2007. A man who ate near the Pope, walked near the Pope, breathed the same air in the same corridors every single day, and who decided at some point that what he was witnessing could not stay hidden. Gabriele was arrested on the 23rd of May, 2012, after Vatican police found confidential letters and documents in his apartment. He went to trial. He said he had stolen the documents to fight evil and corruption, to put the Vatican back on track. He was found guilty, sentenced to 18 months. But here is the detail that tells you everything about how the institution works. Gabriele served his sentence inside the Vatican itself, not an Italian prison. The Vatican, because they were afraid that if he went outside, he might say more. Think about that for a moment. The journalist across the table is writing quickly now. Her pen moves without stopping. The man with the recorder leans slightly forward. The third one, the steady one, asks a question in a low voice, and he answers it, and then another question, and he answers that too. The cameras in the corner of the room are rolling. He has been talking for 40 minutes, and he has not stopped once to wonder whether he should. That feeling, the old reflex of checking himself, of measuring every sentence against what is permitted, is gone. He does not know exactly when it left. Maybe at the airport, maybe when the stamp came down on the forged passport, maybe right now, when he said his name and the ceiling did not fall. He tells them about Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, about the letters Vigano wrote to the Pope and to Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, the Secretary of State. Letters complaining of corruption in Vatican finances. Letters describing a campaign of defamation against him personally. Vigam had been the second-ranked Vatican administrator, a man deep inside the machine, and even he had found himself transferred when he pushed too hard against what he found. The letters ended up with Nuzzi. They ended up in print. And the Vatican had to watch as its own senior officials' private complaints became public record. He tells them what it felt like to work inside an institution that responded to exposure not with correction but with containment. Every leak was followed not by an investigation into the wrongdoing described, but by an investigation into who had done the describing. Pope Benedict appointed a commission of 3 cardinals in March of 2012. Their job was not to fix the corruption. Their job was to find the source of the documents. They interviewed much of the Vatican bureaucracy. They reported directly to the Pope, and somewhere in the course of that investigation, according to what eventually became known, they found something else entirely. A sex and blackmail scandal woven through the institution alongside the financial one. The commission delivered its report on the 17th of December 2012. That same day, Benedict reportedly made the decision to resign. He announced it publicly in February of 2013. The first pope to resign of his own will in nearly 600 years. The journalist with steady eyes looks up from her notebook. She says, "And you believe the report is what made him decide?" He looks at the table for a moment. He thinks about how to say this accurately. He says, "I believe a man read a document describing what his institution had become, and he put it down, and he decided he could not carry it anymore." She writes that down too. By the time the first session ends, it is past noon. Someone brings sandwiches. He eats without tasting them. His throat is dry from talking. His hands, he notices, have stopped shaking. They were shaking when he sat down. He had not realized until now, feeling their stillness, that they had been. The coordinated release begins that afternoon. He has not done this alone. The journalists have been preparing for weeks. Lawyers in 3 countries have reviewed the documents he carried out. Copies exist in multiple locations, a precaution everyone agreed on without needing to discuss why. Editors in Rome, in London, in Brussels have been briefed. The plan is simultaneous publication across multiple outlets, in multiple languages, so that no single legal intervention can stop it. So that by the time the Vatican's lawyers begin making calls, the story is already everywhere. At 2:47 in the afternoon, the first report goes live. He is sitting in the hotel room when it happens. Someone shows him a phone. The headline is in Italian. He reads it and feels something he does not have a clean word for. Not triumph, not relief, something older and quieter. The feeling of a door opening that has been shut for a very long time. Within the hour, the story is in German, then French, then English. His name is in each version. His face, from an interview recorded that morning, appears on the evening news in 4 countries. By 8 o'clock, Vatican correspondents are filing urgent updates from St. Peter's Square. By 10, every major European network has picked up the story. His phone rings constantly. He does not answer most of the calls. The ones he answers are from the journalists he trusts, coordinating the next stage. His first live interview is scheduled for the following morning, a television studio in Geneva. He will sit under lights and answer questions in front of a camera that broadcasts to millions of people. He will say his name again. He will say it as many times as necessary. He sits by the window that night and watches the lights on the lake. He thinks about Paolo Gabriele, the butler who said he acted to fight evil and corruption, the man who was convicted and sentenced and pardoned and who died on the 24th of November 2020 at the age of 54 following a long illness, a man who carried documents out of a building and paid for it with years of his life. He thinks about Viganò, who wrote letters that were meant to stay private and watched them become headlines. He thinks about Claudio Ciappelletti, the computer specialist who gave conflicting information to prosecutors and was convicted of obstruction of justice, sentenced to 4 months, reduced to 2 months suspended. All of them, people who got close to the truth and were processed by the institution's machinery of response. He wonders what that machinery is building for him right now. He does not have to wonder long. The Vatican's first official response comes the next morning, before his television interview begins. A statement from the press office, delivered through Federico Lombardi, the Vatican spokesman. The statement does not address the documents. It does not address the specific allegations. It questions his credibility. It questions his mental stability. It describes him, in careful institutional language, as a person with personal grievances, someone acting out of bitterness rather than conscience. It suggests he was never in the positions of authority he claims. It implies, without stating directly, that a man who would do what he has done is not a man whose word should be trusted. He reads the statement in the green room of the television studio, sitting in a makeup chair while someone presses powder onto his forehead under the bright lights. He has seen this before. Not done to him, done to others. The Vatican does not fight documents with counter-documents. It fights people with the suggestion that the people are broken, that they are unstable, that their testimony is the product of a damaged mind rather than a clear one. Gabriele's trial had included psychiatric evaluations that produced conflicting results. One concluded he suffered from a fragile personality with paranoid tendencies. Another found no major psychological disorder at all. 2 reports, 2 conclusions. The institution chose the one that served it. He sits in the chair and looks at himself in the mirror, powder on his face, a collar he no longer wears, a name that is now public, a history that cannot be undone. He thinks of John L. Allen Jr., the Vatican correspondent, who said during the 2012 scandal that it was not so much the content of the leaks, but the fact of them that was the real problem. He was right. The content could be managed, minimized, explained. The fact of them, the existence of someone willing to carry them out, willing to stand in front of a camera and say their name, that was the thing the institution could not absorb. The producer knocks on the door. 2 minutes. He stands. He straightens his jacket. He walks out of the green room and down a short hallway and through a door into a studio where 3 cameras are pointed at 2 chairs and a moderator is already seated, reviewing notes. He sits down. The lights are warm on his face. The moderator looks up and introduces herself, and they shake hands. A technician clips a small microphone to his lapel. Someone calls a countdown from off-camera. 5, 4, 3, he breathes. 2, 1. The moderator begins. She says his name. She says where he worked. She asks him to describe, in his own words, what he witnessed inside the Vatican's financial operations and why he decided to come forward now. He looks directly into the camera. He does not look away. He talks for 43 minutes. He is specific. He names figures. He describes processes. He references documents that are, at this moment, being read by journalists and investigators in multiple countries. He describes the culture of silence that made the corruption possible. He describes what happens to people who push back, who write letters, who ask questions, who carry files to apartments and get arrested and convicted and pardoned in ways that are designed to send a message to everyone watching. He describes what it cost him to leave. He does not ask for sympathy. He does not present himself as a hero. He presents himself as a witness. When it is over, the moderator thanks him. He unclips the microphone and hands it back to the technician. In the car back to the hotel, someone shows him his phone. The Vatican has issued a second statement. It is longer this time, more specific in its attacks. It describes him as someone who was removed from his position for cause. It claims his accusations are motivated by a desire for personal revenge. It says the documents he claims to possess cannot be verified. It says the Church takes all legitimate concerns through proper internal channels and that this is not a legitimate concern. It says he is mentally unstable. It says he is lying. He reads it twice. Then he sets the phone face down on the seat beside him and looks out the window at the Geneva streets moving past. A tram goes by. People wait at a crossing, collars up against the cold. Ordinary life, continuous and indifferent and real. He thought the hard part was leaving. He was wrong. He thought the hard part was the airport, the passport, the stamp, the cold air, and the diesel smell and the suitcase with everything he owned. He was wrong about that too. He thought that once he said what he knew, once the documents were out, once his face was on screens and his name was in print, the weight would lift. And some of it has. He will not pretend otherwise. Some of it is gone. The part that comes from carrying a secret alone in a body that was never built to hold it. That part is lighter now. But a new weight has settled in its place, because the Vatican is not going to stop. It is not going to read his testimony and hold a press conference and say that he was right. It is going to do what institutions have always done when someone steps outside and points back at them. It is going to make him the story. It is going to question his mind, his motives, his history, his character. It is going to find everyone who ever had a grievance against him and give them a microphone. It is going to be patient, and it is going to be methodical, and it is going to outlast him if it can. He knew this. He knew it before he left. He knew it when he packed the documents, when he memorized the journalist's number, when he stood in the cold air outside the airport and felt free for the first time. He knew it, and he came anyway. But knowing something and living inside it are two different countries. He is in the second one now. Telling the truth had been, in the end, the easier part. He had stood in front of cameras and said what he saw, and the words had come without effort, clean and clear, and finally, out in the open. What comes next is something else entirely. What comes next is surviving the cost of having told it. The verification comes fast, faster than he expected. Within days of his testimony going public, 3 separate journalists working independently confirm the documents are genuine, not similar, not consistent with, genuine. The financial records match, the internal correspondence matches, the dates, the signatures, the routing of funds through accounts that should not exist. All of it holds. He sits in a borrowed apartment and watches a news ticker scroll his name across the bottom of a television screen. He should feel something enormous right now. He feels nothing at all. That emptiness is its own kind of answer, because he had imagined this moment. He had imagined it for years, lying awake in his small room, rehearsing what vindication would feel like. He had pictured it as a kind of sunrise, warm, gradual, something that would fill the chest and stay there. What actually arrives is more like the silence after an explosion, the ringing, the dust, the moment when you look around and try to count who is still standing. Law enforcement agencies opened formal investigations within the week. Not 1, 3. Italian prosecutors had been watching certain financial threads for years, and his documents give them the knot they needed to pull. Interpol begins coordinating with authorities in 2 other countries. A magistrate in Rome issues a statement confirming that the materials are being examined as part of a broader inquiry into the movement of funds through ecclesiastical structures. 30 years of silence, and the world catches up in 7 days. He does not sleep well. The apartment smells of someone else's cooking, old oil and garlic soaked into the walls, and he lies on a narrow bed, staring at a ceiling he does not recognize. His legs ache. He has been sitting in chairs for days, answering questions, repeating himself, watching people write things down. His throat is dry by mid-morning every day, and stays dry until he forces himself to drink water he does not want. Then the others start coming forward. A priest from a diocese in northern Italy contacts the journalists first, then a former seminary administrator, then a financial officer who had worked inside one of the auxiliary bodies for 11 years before quietly resigning. They had all seen pieces of it. None of them had seen the whole picture, but together, laid beside his testimony, the pieces form something unmistakable. He speaks to one of them by phone. The man's voice is careful, measured, the voice of someone who has been practicing what to say for a long time. He recognizes that voice. He used to have it himself. "I did not think anyone would believe me alone," the man says. He tells him he understands. Then he catches himself, because understanding is not the right word for what passes between them. It is something older and quieter than that. Recognition, maybe. The specific relief of knowing that what you witnessed was real, because someone else witnessed it too. He puts the phone down and sits for a long time without moving. This is the part that should feel like victory. Corroboration from multiple sources. Formal investigations. The machinery of accountability finally turning. He had given 30 years of his life to an institution that had asked him to be quiet, and now the world was loud with what he had said. But the phone calls from his family have stopped. His sister had called twice in the first week. Short calls, careful ones, full of pauses where words should have been. She had not said she was proud of him. She had not said she was ashamed. She had said, "Mama is not doing well with this," and left the rest unspoken. His mother is 78 years old. She had watched her son's face on a television screen and seen the words beneath it, the words about investigations and excommunication and betrayal, and something in her had gone very still. He knows this without being told. He knows it the way you know when a door has closed in a house you grew up in. You do not have to be standing next to it. He calls her number on a Tuesday evening. It rings. It rings again, 7 times. He counts them. She does not answer. He calls again on Wednesday and Thursday. She does not answer. He sets the phone on the table and looks at his hands. These are the hands that held the chalice for 30 years. That turned the pages of 1,000 liturgies. That signed his name to documents he believed in, and later to documents he did not, and finally to the testimony that broke everything open. His hands look the same as they always have. That seems wrong somehow. The op-ed appears on a Friday morning. He sees it first as a link sent by one of the journalists, with no accompanying message, just the link and a single word. He opens it and reads the name at the top and stops breathing for a moment. 20 years. They had eaten at the same table for 20 years. He had attended this man's mother's funeral. They had argued about theology in the way that only people who trust each other argue, with heat and laughter and no fear of the conclusion. He had considered this man, without ever saying it aloud, one of the few people in his life who truly saw him. The op-ed is careful. It does not call him a liar outright. It questions his stability. It raises his history of what it calls institutional friction, a phrase that means, in plain language, that he had sometimes pushed back against decisions he found wrong. It suggests that his motivations are less about conscience and more about grievance. It uses the word troubled twice. He reads it to the end. The smell of the coffee he made that morning has gone cold and stale in the cup beside him. He does not drink it. He does not call the man. There is nothing to say that would matter. The piece has been written and published, and it is out in the world now, doing what it was designed to do. And he knows, with a clarity that sits in his chest like a stone, that the man who wrote it probably believed some of it. That is the part that cannot be argued with. You cannot fight what a person has decided to feel. The formal letter from the Vatican arrives on a Monday. It comes in an official envelope, cream-colored, the kind of paper that communicates authority simply by its weight. He does not open it immediately. He sets it on the table and makes tea and stands at the window for a while, watching pigeons move across a rooftop across the street. Then he opens it. The language is formal, Latin, precise and cold, the kind of Latin that has been used for centuries to close doors on people. The word he has been expecting is there, excommunicatus, excommunicated, separated from the body of the church, removed from the sacraments, cut from the community he had served since he was a young man who still believed that faith and institution were the same thing. He puts the letter down. He is no longer a priest in the eyes of the church he gave his life to. He is no longer a Catholic in the formal sense. He is, by the definitions that governed every morning of his adult life, outside. He had known this was coming. He had known it the way you know a storm is coming when the air changes. But knowing it and holding the paper are two entirely different things. The paper is real. The paper is specific. The paper has his name on it in ink. He sits with it for a long time. Outside, the city moves the way cities do. Traffic, voices. Somewhere below, a child is laughing at something, a bright, uncomplicated sound that has nothing to do with any of this. He thinks about the first Mass he ever celebrated. He had been so nervous that his hands shook on the chalice. An older priest had stood beside him and said nothing, just placed one hand briefly on his shoulder, and the shaking had stopped. He thinks about that hand, the specific weight of it, the way it had communicated, without a single word, that he was not alone. He is alone now. The investigations are real. The corroboration is real. Other men are stepping forward, and the structure he exposed is beginning to answer for itself in the language of courts and magistrates and formal inquiries. History will record what happened here. He believes that. He has to believe that. But history does not call your mother back. History does not sit across from a friend of 20 years and explain what you meant, what you were trying to do, why you could not stay quiet any longer. History does not fill the silence in a borrowed apartment at 11 o'clock at night when the television is off and the phone is not ringing and the letter on the table says, in the oldest language of the institution you loved, that you are no longer welcome inside it. He had walked away from the Vatican because he could not stay and remain honest. That part was true. That part will always be true. But he had also believed, somewhere beneath the fear and the resolve, that truth would cost less than this, that the people who loved him would see what he saw, that the church he had served would be capable, eventually, of recognizing what it owed to the people it had harmed. He looks at the letter again. He looks at his phone, dark and silent on the table beside it. He had won. The journalists said so. The investigators said so. Other priests said so. Men who had carried their own versions of this weight for years and were only now setting it down. By every measure that the world uses to judge these things, he had won. He picks up the letter. He folds it once, carefully, along its original crease. And he sits in the quiet of a room that is not his, in a city that is not home, wondering if there is a version of winning that does not feel, in the bone and the chest and the long silences of the night, exactly like this. A year passes. Then 2. Then 5. The investigations do not end. They expand. They reach into dioceses he had never heard of, into records sealed for decades, into the testimonies of men and women who had carried their silence like stones in their chests and were only now, finally, setting them down. He watches this from a distance at first, then from closer, then from inside the rooms where it happens, sitting at long tables under fluorescent lights with a glass of water in front of him and a microphone angled toward his face. His voice does not shake anymore. That surprised him the first time he noticed it. He answers questions with the precision of someone who has spent years preparing, not because he rehearsed, but because he lived it. Every date, every name, every document he had photographed, copied, carried out of offices in folders tucked under his arm. It is all there, in the bone, in the chest, in the part of memory that does not forget what it costs to remember. The convictions come, not enough of them, not fast enough. The sentences, when they land, are lighter than the crimes deserved. He reads the verdicts on his phone in a coffee shop, or in the hallway outside a courtroom, or once, memorably, on a train moving through flat countryside in the grey early morning, the fields still dark, the sky just beginning to separate from the land. He reads the number of years. He thinks about the number of children. He puts his phone in his pocket and watches the fields go past. This is what justice smells like, he thinks. Not clean, not satisfying. It smells like old paper and institutional carpet, and the particular staleness of rooms where difficult things are decided by people who would rather be somewhere else. The church announces reforms. Some of them are genuine. He can tell the difference, now, between the real ones and the cosmetic ones, because he spent enough years inside the machinery to know which gears actually turn and which ones are painted on for show. New protocols for reporting. Independent oversight bodies. Mandatory training. Some of it is real. Some of it is a press release wearing the costume of change. He testifies about what he knows. He does not editorialize. He does not perform grief or anger for the cameras or the committees. He simply answers what is asked with the steadiness of a man who has already done his grieving in private and has nothing left to prove to anyone in this room. But every time he walks out of a hearing, there is a sensation in his legs he cannot fully explain, not weakness, not quite. more like the feeling of having walked a very long distance and only just now realizing how far it was. He is watching the institution he loved be taken apart, piece by piece, and examined under light it was never designed to withstand. And he is one of the people holding the light. He knows this. He chose this. He would choose it again. But choosing something does not make it painless. There is a particular grief that belongs to this kind of work, and it does not have a clean name. It is not the grief of losing someone. It is not the grief of failure. It is the grief of being right about something you desperately wished you were wrong about. It is the grief of watching every new conviction confirm what you knew, which means confirming also that it was real, that it happened, that all those years of silence inside the institution meant children were not safe in places they were supposed to be safest. Every conviction is a victory. Every conviction is also a door closing on a version of the world where none of this needed to happen. He rebuilds a life, slowly, the way you rebuild anything that has been taken down to its foundations. He finds work, not in the church, not in anything adjacent to the church. He teaches for a while. He consults. He writes, though not for publication, not yet. He moves twice in 3 years, each apartment a little more his own than the last, a little less temporary feeling, though the feeling of temporariness never quite leaves. He makes new friends. This is harder than he expected, not because people are unkind, because he carries a story that is heavy to hand to someone new, and he cannot hand them only part of it without feeling dishonest, and handing them all of it early tends to change the shape of the room. Some friendships hold anyway. He is grateful for those in a way that goes beyond words. The friends he lost, the ones from before, the ones who chose the institution over the truth, or who simply could not bear to stand near what he had become. Those absences do not heal. They scar. There is a difference. Scars are permanent. They do not hurt every day, but they are always there. And sometimes, in certain lights, in certain silences, you become aware of them again with a sharpness that takes your breath away. He goes to Mass once, about 4 years in, a small parish, far from Rome, far from anywhere that would recognize his face. He sits in the back. He listens to the readings. He watches an old woman in the third pew move her lips in silent prayer, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed, her face carrying something that looks, from a distance, like peace. He does not take communion. He is not sure what he believes anymore, not in the precise doctrinal sense he once believed it. But something in him is still present in that room, still reaching towards something he cannot fully name. He stays until the end. He leaves before anyone can speak to him. He does not go back. But he does not regret going. The reforms continue. Some of the oversight bodies begin to show real teeth. A bishop is removed. Then another. A cardinal faces proceedings that would have been unthinkable 10 years earlier. He reads about each one and feels something complicated move through him, something that is not quite satisfaction and not quite sorrow and is, he thinks, probably the closest thing to both at once. He had not wanted to destroy the church. That had never been the point. He had wanted it to be what it claimed to be. He had believed once that it could be. He is no longer sure what he believes about that. But he watches the changes accumulate, the slow institutional reckoning grinding forward the way institutional reckonings do, imperfectly, incompletely, but forward, and he thinks, this is real. Some of this is real. Children are safer in some places than they were. That is not nothing. That is not nothing. But there are nights, still, when the apartment is quiet and the phone is dark, and the particular silence of a life lived outside the structure that shaped you settles in, like cold air through a gap in a window, and he feels the full weight of what was exchanged, not traded. Exchanged. Because he did not choose loss, he chose truth, and loss came with it, unbidden, attached, the way shadow is attached to light. His mother calls more often now. That is something. The distance between them is not gone, but it has become something they can speak around, carefully, the way you speak around a bruise. She does not fully understand what he did or why, but she calls. He answers. That matters more than he can say. He is asked in an interview whether it was worth it. The journalist is young, earnest. She asks the question with the directness of someone who genuinely wants to know, not someone looking for a headline. He looks at her for a moment. Outside the window behind her, a city moves through its ordinary afternoon. Buses, pigeons, a man on a bicycle carrying a paper bag. The ordinary, unstoppable motion of a world that does not stop for anyone's reckoning. He is quiet for a long time, long enough that the journalist does not try to fill the silence, long enough that the room feels different by the time he speaks. Children are safer now, he says. His voice is steady. It is always steady now. That matters. It matters more than I can explain to you, and I would not want to try because I do not think words are adequate to it. He stops. He looks at his hands on the table. But I would trade every single victory to have my life back. He says it without drama, without performance. The way you say something true that you have known for a long time and are only now saying aloud. And I can never have that. The journalist writes something down. The room is very quiet. Outside, the city keeps moving. He does not add anything. There is nothing to add. The sentence is complete. The accounting is complete, as much as it will ever be. He had walked out of the Vatican with documents in his hands and truth in his chest, and the naive, desperate hope that honesty would cost less than it did. He had been wrong about the cost. He had been right about everything else. The journalist thanks him. He nods. He stands, shakes her hand, and walks out into the afternoon. The city does not notice him. The buses run. The pigeons scatter and resettle. A man on a bicycle turns a corner and is gone. He walks, just walks, no destination, no particular direction. The pavement is cold through the soles of his shoes, and the air smells faintly of exhaust and something baking, bread or pastry, warm and ordinary and entirely indifferent to the weight of what he carries. He walks until the weight feels, if not lighter, then at least familiar. That is enough. For today, that is enough. 10 years is a long time to carry something. Long enough that the weight stops feeling like weight and starts feeling like you. Long enough that the man who walked out of the Vatican with documents in his hands and terror in his chest has become, quietly, someone else. Someone he did not plan to be. Someone he is still some mornings surprised to find in the mirror. He lives simply now. A modest apartment, 2 rooms, maybe 3. Books stacked on shelves that were never quite enough for all the books. A small window that lets in the morning light at an angle that he has learned over years to find beautiful. The city outside is one he chose for safety, not sentiment, and we will not name it here because he asked us not to, and that request deserves to be honored. He has given enough. We will not give away what little shelter he has left. He makes his own coffee. He walks in the mornings early before the city fills. He works with human rights organizations, the kind that do the slow and unglamorous work of documentation, of testimony, of making sure that what happened to someone in a room no one was watching gets written down somewhere permanent. He gives occasional lectures at universities. Students ask him questions he has answered 100 times, and he answers them again, carefully, because the students are young and the questions are not stupid and the answers still matter. He has rebuilt something, not the life he was supposed to have. That life is gone, and he knows it, the way you know a door is locked without having to try the handle again. But something, a life with purpose, if not with peace, a life with meaning, if not with ease. And here is what he could not have predicted. Here is what none of them predicted. In the years after he walked away, others walked too. Not immediately, not in a rush, but one by one, in the slow and frightened way that courage actually works. People in institutions around the world looked at what he had done and made the same terrible calculation. They weighed what they knew against what it would cost to say it. And some of them, not all of them, but some, decided the cost was worth paying. Whistleblowers came forward from corporations hiding environmental damage, from governments concealing the treatment of prisoners, from churches, not just his, but others, denominations across continents, where the same patterns of concealment had calcified into the same institutional reflex. Some of them cited him directly. Some of them cited the principle he had embodied, without knowing his name, the principle that one person telling the truth in a room full of people determined to keep silent can crack something open that cannot be sealed again. He heard about them one by one. A woman in a pharmaceutical company who released internal documents showing a drug had been approved despite known risks. A mid-level official in a government ministry who handed a journalist evidence of systematic falsification of welfare records. A priest in South America who had watched his superior silence complaints for a decade and finally could not watch anymore. He read their names in newspapers. He read about the consequences they faced, the legal battles, the job losses, the isolation, the years of their lives consumed by the machinery of institutional retaliation. He did not feel proud, exactly. Pride is too clean a word for what he felt. He felt something closer to grief and solidarity at the same time, the way you feel when someone you love makes the same mistake you made, knowing it was not a mistake, knowing they had no other honest choice, and wishing with everything in you that the world had been different enough to give them laws changed. Slowly, as laws do, moving through the grinding machinery of legislative process, amended and argued over and weakened in committee and strengthened on the floor and signed into documents that most people would never read. Whistleblower protection statutes were strengthened in several jurisdictions. The evidence he had provided, the documents he had carried out, the testimony he had given in rooms that smelled of coffee and legal paper, and the particular anxiety of people who know they are building a case that will outlast them, that evidence became part of the foundation. Not the whole foundation. He was not the whole story, but part of it. A brick in a wall that was slowly, imperfectly becoming harder to knock down. He does not claim the credit. He is careful about that, almost obsessive about it, because he has seen what happens when a person starts to believe their suffering entitles them to ownership of a movement. It does not. The people who came after him, the ones who made their own impossible choices in their own impossible moments, they own their own courage. He only showed that survival was possible, just barely, but possible. There are mornings when the old life visits him, not as grief exactly, but as texture. The smell of incense in a stone corridor, the sound of plain chant rising through a chapel before dawn, thin and cold and very beautiful. The feeling of vestments, the particular weight of them, the way they settled on the shoulders like a kind of authority. He had loved those things. He wants to be honest about that, because the story is easier if he had been miserable the whole time, if the institution had given him nothing worth mourning. But it had. It had given him beauty and community and a framework for meaning that he had believed in completely. He had not been pretending. He had been faithful in the old sense of that word, full of faith, right up until the moment the faith broke against something it could not survive. What breaks a person's faith is never abstract. It is always specific. It is always a name, a face, a document, a moment in a particular room on a particular afternoon when something you could not unknow entered your eyes and refused to leave. For him, it was all of those things. And the weight of what he knew had eventually become heavier than the weight of what he stood to lose. That was the whole of it. That was the calculation, reduced to its simplest form. He still prays sometimes. He does not know exactly what he is praying to. He is honest about that uncertainty, the way he is honest about most things now, because dishonesty costs too much and he has already paid more than he can afford. He prays the way you might speak into a room where someone used to be, not certain they can hear you, not certain the room is empty, just speaking, because the habit of speaking to something larger than yourself is not so easy to unlearn, and because some mornings the alternative, the silence, is heavier than the uncertainty. Faith, he has come to believe, is not a building. It is not an institution. It is not a hierarchy of men in vestments making decisions in rooms that most people are not allowed to enter. Faith is something smaller and more stubborn than that. It is the thing that makes you get up in the morning when getting up costs you something. It is the thing that makes you tell the truth when lying would be so much easier and so much safer, and no one would know the difference. It is, he thinks, the thing that made him walk out of the Vatican with those documents. Not courage exactly, not strategy. Something older and less articulable than either of those words. The collar is on a shelf in his apartment. He has kept it all these years. Not as a symbol of faith, he is clear about that, not as a reminder of what he once believed or what he once was. He keeps it as a monument to a moment, to the specific afternoon when he took it off for the last time and set it down and felt the air on his neck and understood, in the way you understand things that happen in your body before they happen in your mind, that something was over, that he was choosing himself over the institution that had shaped him, that the choice was irreversible, that it was right. He does not regret it. He wants to be clear about that too. The regret he carries is not for the choice. It is for the world that made the choice necessary. It is for the children who needed someone to speak before he did and found no one. It is for the years consumed by legal proceedings and exile and the particular loneliness of a person who has told a truth that others would have preferred to stay buried. The regret is for the cost, not the action. There is a difference. It matters. In his final interview for this documentary, the camera catches him in the apartment. The morning light comes through that window at its familiar angle. He is sitting very still, the way he has learned to sit, the way a person sits when stillness has become a discipline rather than a rest. The interviewer asks him if he still believes in God. He does not answer immediately. The silence is not uncomfortable. It is the silence of a man who has learned that some questions deserve more than a reflex. "I don't know," he finally says. The words are quiet, honest, undefended. "But I know I believe in truth. And truth, I've learned, is sacred too." The camera pulls back slowly. It shows the whole room now. The books. The small window. The shelf where the collar rests, dark against the pale wall, still and permanent, and carrying all the weight of a life that went one way instead of another. He does not look at it. He does not need to. He knows it is there. The way you know the things that have shaped you are always there, present in the room even when you are not looking at them. He sits alone in the quiet of the morning. And then his voice comes again, not in the room, but over the image, the way a voice sounds when it is speaking from somewhere beyond the moment the camera captured. "The question isn't whether I made the right choice," he says. "The question is, why did it have to cost so much?" The screen goes dark. The voice does not answer its own question. There is no answer to give. There is only the question, hanging in the silence, the way questions do when they are the kind that entire systems of power have spent centuries hoping no one would think to ask.